Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 7 of Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I can't believe 7 seasons are upon us. It feels like we were starting this just yesterday, but it was in fact almost 2 years ago that Season 1 of Bios and Bookmarks premiered, and it's been such a pleasure to keep bringing these live interviews to you time and again. The name of this season is A Change is Gonna Come, based on that line from the anthemic Sam Cooke song, and it's devoted to social progress in these deeply uncertain times. How can we make the world better from where we are here in the Caribbean space? And how does our Caribbean space enable us to be better citizens and custodians of it? I am Shivanee Ramlochan, and I'm delighted, beyond what I can say, to be joined today by Andil Gosine, author of Nature's Wild. Andil, welcome to Bios and Bookmarks.
Shivani, thank you so much for having me here today.
Andil's book is a monograph, which means it is devoted near exclusively to one particular subject. And it's the kind of book that might seem intimidating at first, but I promise you, once you open the pages, you will find yourself transported. Allow me to tell you a little bit more about Andal. He is Professor of Environmental Arts and Justice at York University, Toronto. His scholarship and artistic and curatorial practices examine imbrications of ecology, desire, and migration, and include numerous publications and multimedia projects, including his monograph, Nature's Wild: Love, Sex, and Law in the Caribbean, published by Duke University Press. Recent exhibitions of his work include Revenue, Port of Spain 2020, Deities, Parts 1 and 2, New York in 2019, and Cooley Cooley Vien and All the Flowers, various locations in Canada, 2018. He was curator of the retrospective exhibition Wendy Nanan at the Art Museum of the Americas in Washington, D.C. And there's so much I could say and will say about Nature's Wild, but I think the best way to introduce this book, which is singular and remarkable and deeply transgressive, to our audience, is to invite you to give us your first reading from it.
Thank you, Shivani, and thank you everyone who's here and to the Bocas family for this lovely, warm embrace, which I deeply appreciate. Um, I'll launch into 3 excerpts from the book, starting with the introduction and then the beginnings of chapters 1 and 3. I was late to learn of sex. I was 13 years old and in my second year at Presentation College, a Catholic all-boys school atop San Fernando Hill in Trinidad. 20-something-year-old Mr. Ramkisoon, not his real name, was talking us through the brackets and multiplication and square roots that would lead to a solution X. So much a favorite activity of mine that I often asked him for extra algebra homework. Sadly, a true story. Mr. Ramkison was one of our few male teachers to don a stylish contemporary wardrobe. Those teachers who were brothers of the order sported long white cotton robes, while a favorite of the older men was the shirt jack, better known internationally as the Cuban-associated guayabera. Mr. Ramkison's daily wardrobe comprised a form-fitting shirt tucked into narrow-leg slacks, a sharp contrast to the shining navy blue polyester of the heavy-set, rosy-faced visitor who suddenly appeared and interrupted our lesson in algebra that afternoon. Father Larry, not his real name, would occasionally make these visits to provide moral instruction. Neither the students nor teacher were told in advance about when he might appear, thus ensuring a sense of trepidation permanently hung in the air. The two exchanged a few words, and after a quickly forgotten note indicating the transition, Mr. Ramkissoon abruptly left the classroom. Father Larry pointed to the row of students in which I happened to be seated and ordered the five of us to stand up. "Prove to me," he instructed, "that you are not a homosexual." We stood silent in the nook between surface and seat of our creaky wooden desks. Father Larry paused, his slanted smile signaling sadistic delight about the humiliation that was certain to unfold. Another pause, and I could see his hand ready to lift and point at one of us to prompt an answer. I was sure that his pointing finger was to land in my direction. Instead, a confident, cheerful voice broke the silence. "Show me the girls next door," snapped Ramsing from the back row. Where else would the appointed class jester sit? "And I'll give you proof." Everyone, including Father Larry, erupted into laughter. This spontaneous burst of heterosexual teenage lust rescued the classroom's five potential homosexuals, including me, from the burden of proof. But I was so caught up in my shame that nothing he said registered after that, although I'm sure he must have stayed for at least an hour. The minute Father Larry finally exited, I turned to a classmate for relief. "What," I asked, "is a homosexual?" His answer prompted another question. "But what is sex?" He filled me in some more, much to my surprise and horror. This provocation from Father Larry was my entry point for conscious thinking about sexual desire. 30 years later, I'm struck about how efficiently this encounter maps the complex terrain of historical antecedents for the production and regulation of sexualities in colonized territories like Trinidad and Tobago, identifies some of the main actors engaged, and signs important questions and tensions at the heart of contemporary debates about sexual rights. Our exchange with Father Larry, a microcosmic expression of a dynamic produced and reproduced in scales large and small, in contexts past and present, offers evidence of the key arguments presented about sexual rights struggles in the Anglophone Caribbean in scholarship and popular media, signing both the long, structured history of homophobia that actively delegitimizes non-heterosexual sex and the primary role played by the Christian church and state institutions like schools in its production. As in the encounter with Father Larry, however, this history is complicated and layered with contradictions. Just as Father Larry's disciplining of homosexuality simultaneously introduced me, and I would guess, other boys to its very possibility, and may have even worked to sanction homoerotic imaginations, so too have related cultural and legal codes intended to control sexuality also produced ambivalent consequences, sometimes positing completely different effects, consciously and subconsciously. The exchange between Father Larry and us students is an example of a 5 centuries long struggle put to Caribbean peoples to prove ourselves human and not wild like animals. And from there, I will jump to chapter 1, which is called Punga, which I'm curious to know if it's a word that many people in the audience recognize. And I'll read a short excerpt from that as well, chapter 1. Father Larry's fixation on homosexuality was likely an expression of his own internal struggles as an expression of his commitment to spreading an interpretation of the gospel. But it also reflected the realities of homoerotic sexual socialization that happened at a place like Presentation College. Its student population comprised entirely of adolescent boys in the throes and aftermath of puberty. When explorations were not openly sanctioned and cast as acceptable homosocial behavior, boys found crevices and corners in this environment to indulge curiosities about their own and one another's changing bodies. I have since learned from other presentation alumni, for example, that my inability to carry a single musical note meant that I missed out on an early initiation to oral sex, a not infrequent ritual shared between boys behind auditorium curtains during choir practice. Other graduates of the schools have shared stories of presentation being the site of their first experiences of same-sex kissing, mutual masturbation, and even, if somewhat on the nose for a Catholic church, an introduction to and perhaps socialization towards sadomasochism. One presentation alumnus who went to the school in the 1970s shared with me stories of being cruised by other students in the classroom and even an attempted but failed, quote, match with another boy facilitated by a school administrator who himself seemed titillated by the prospect. The wily delight of Father Larry's facial expression when he directed us to prove ourselves, quote, not homosexual, suggested the pleasure he derived from the experience was not entirely due to his indoctrination in religious morality. Inside and outside the classroom at presentation, homoerotic socialization was often meted out under the guise of discipline and punishment. And boys who often mimic priests' condemnation of homosexuality in the creation of the rituals that would ironically engage practices of it. During the entirety of my 3 years at the school, we junior boys most lived in fear of what was called polling by the senior boys. Those of us who ventured near the senior block buildings risked being grabbed by some of the older boys and having our legs spread apart as we pushed against and up and down a pole, all for a boisterous audience cheering on the intended degradation. I lived in fear of this exercise because the space I most occupied at the school was its library, which was located adjacent to the sixth form block. Although I carefully mapped out a path that would entirely voided the polling area, its close proximity meant that I was always alert to the possibility of being grabbed for an attack. At least twice I exited the library and saw ongoing brutal attacks a few meters away. I was terrified and horrified, understanding in some way, even if I didn't know the term, that polling constituted sexual assault. The institutional accommodation of this kind of violence has mostly gone unrecognized, perhaps because rituals like it have been normalized in exclusively male spaces. Getting polled was the most visible homo-shaming, homoeroticizing ritual during my time at presentation, but former alumni also told me about Rose, a common bullying game at the school in the 1970s, in which the target boy would be surprised by the insertion of the bully's finger through his green polyester uniform pants to tickle his anus. What was Rose in 1970s presentation college was called the Elephant's Walk at the Southern California fraternity of one of Jane Ward's informants in her studies. In this hazing ritual, participants would be required to strip naked and assemble in a circle. Each young man would place one thumb in his mouth and the other in the anus of another boy. Quote, like circus elephants connected by tail and trunk and oogled by human spectators, they walked in a circle, linked thumb to anus, while older members of the fraternity watched and cheered. Elephants Walk explicitly links sodomy and animalization. The transformation into elephants is what grants permissions for the boys to enact anal penetration. And while Ward's text emphasizes examples of homoerotic hazing in Euro-American institutions, contemporary reports of similar practices in Asian countries, especially in the context of military and college environments, have been documented in mass media and various studies. In these rituals, Father Larry's discursive provocation about the homosexual, sexual, heteros disciplining, and homoerotic titillation were executed all at once in the same moment. So in that chapter, I go on to look at different examples of how homosexuality had been disciplined in the Caribbean over its first 500 years. And then I will end the section with the beginning of the third chapter, the father, a godfather, and the specter of beasts old and new. And in this chapter, the father in question is Eric Williams, and the godfather is someone who is close to many of us. I know, beloved in the Bocas community and in various social justice communities at large. My friend and our dearly missed Colin Robinson. 12 years before Father Larry interrupted math class to orient me to homosexuality at Presentation College, Colin Robinson was a student at another Catholic high school, St. Mary's in Port of Spain. St. Fairies, he dubs it. You were at presentation, he adds, noting the prevalent light-hearted stereotype of gender-segregated Catholic schools as hotbeds for homosexual activity. Robinson was the more precocious learner. By age 12, in 1973, Robinson had already presented himself as a homosexual to a number of people. Quote, I remember I woke up in my mother's bed, he recalls. I broke down in tears and told my mother, I think I'm a homo. Robinson is not certain what chain of events unfurled this pronouncement of his desire, but he was, he says, quote, sure of it. The desire was there, manifest, and I had a name for it. His mother's response was to blame herself, believing that her separation from Robinson's father must have caused the transgression. Robinson shared the news that he desired men sexually with others. Quote, I told a priest in the confession booth, and this old white British man replied that it wasn't a sin. At 15, Robinson expressed his, quote, serious, solid crush to the object of his affection, a teacher who in turn reported the news to his mother, and off he was sent to see a psychiatrist, who it turned out was also gay. Because I was a bright boy, Robinson surmises, I was protected and had people around me who were invested in my welfare. It was very much about protecting me because I was a bright boy. Schools like St. Mary's and Presentation College were expected to produce the new leaders of the nation, after all. Of Trinidad and Tobago's 7 prime ministers, 2 were graduates of Presentation. In 1980, Robinson's academic prowess resulted in a national scholarship to Yale University. A few psychology classes and one particularly brutal theater course later, however, he dropped out. Robinson moved to New York City and remained there for the next 25 years, most of that time as an undocumented immigrant. The heady world of the city's art and activist scenes of the 1980s and 1990s would become his training ground and included work with such organizations as Black and White Men Together, the Committee of Black Gay Men, the Black Hearts Collective, Other Countries, and the Gay Men's Health Crisis. He also co-founded the Audre Lorde Project. Quote, moving in Caribbean communities in New York in the Reagan Bush era, during the rise and demise of the Green Era Revolution, violence against Marxist governments in Latin America and South Africa, and the struggle against apartheid also gave me a political grounding. In 2006, the death of his longest-term partner and his growing frustration with New York politics made him begin to think about leaving the city. Quote, George Bush had been reelected, and I had no idea what I was doing in these people's country. It was also around that time that his migrant status was finally legalized. Though he continued to maintain his status as a US resident, he laughs when he explains that he went home to Trinidad for Carnival 2007, he packed a large suitcase. Quote, you get a green card so you can go home, he joked. My ex-partner and I used to talk about how we would never go back to live in Ghana or Trinidad, he said. But after he was gone, I wasn't sure what I had in America anymore. So I think I'll pause there and turn it back to you, Shivanee.
Thank you so much for that reading, Andil. It's true that you and your voice, reading your words, brings it to life in previously unfathomable ways. I think that when readers come to Nature is Wild for the first time, even if they understand the premise of what the monograph is seeking to do, they can reasonably expect to be shocked. But the way that you read to us is a delightful shock to all the senses and a true provocation of the highest order. And if we're talking about what changes the world in this season of Bios and Bookmarks, then I think it is exactly books like yours that truly feel to be written from that perfect combination of praxis, intellect, and supreme passion. And I wanted to begin our conversation by asking you about origins, which might seem a little simplistic, but I think it's important with a work like this. We've certainly all been queer in this space in the Caribbean. And as I, and there you are.
I'm back.
Great. So we've certainly all been queer in this space in the Caribbean before recorded history as we understand it. But a book like Nature's Wild is a deeply ambitious project. The, as anyone will see, from even a cursory glance at its bibliography, the number of sources that Andil is calling upon to produce this work are considerable. What do you do when there are parts of a shared and collective queer history that are beyond archiving, that were not possible to be recorded? And I guess another way to ask the question is, knowing that, where did you decide to make a start with the book and how?
Yeah. I think the book is an organic consequence of 15 years of thinking about these issues. As a student and then as a scholar, and as a an academic. I mean, of course, as a student, as a scholar at the same time. But its development was really organic. When I did
Andel is having some slight technical difficulties, but I'm sure he'll be back with us at any moment. He sends his apologies and says that you can kindly blame the greater area of New York for their technical malaise.
I'm really sorry about this, everyone, in the backward space of New York City. This often happens around this time where too many people are on and the service just falls. So I really apologize, but I am back now. Hopefully it'll stay.
That's okay, Andel. I just thoroughly blamed all of New York on your behalf. So
Thanks. So I in the book I talk about being a student in international relations. I had a plan. The whole time when I got to Canada, my only plan was to get back to Trinidad, and I intended to work on environmental issues. And so I studied anything that would be useful, I thought, in coming back to Trinidad and working on environmental issues. And I took a lot of international development classes because that's where, in the context of Canada, often the only place you get to learn and talk about Global South. And in those classrooms, I was really struck by the difference, struck and offended, and by the ways in which the lives, the complexities of people living in the Global South were understood as mechanical, as instrumental, as lacking emotional desire and complexity. And so in that space, I think as an undergraduate student is really the starting point of this book, is because in the class, they, on the one hand, we have, so many layers about romance and chivalry in a Euro-American context. We'd have no music or movies if we weren't so fascinated by the love lives between people. But when it came to thinking about the Global South in that context, it was always very oddly rationalizable statements about people's basic needs. People had sex because they needed children. They needed children to take care of them when they're old. They needed children to labor the land. And all of the ways in which the people who they're talking about, the people who I that I was part of, that I think of my home community in George Village. These were folks that I felt were not seen as fully people because of the ways in which their sexuality was reduced to a function of the economy. So that's when I started to push back. And I thought, I mean, my mom and dad are pretty ridiculously crazy about each other. They've been together forever. If we FaceTime them now, they'd probably be cuddling on the couch. Um, you'd go out with them to a store and you'd catch them like stealing a kiss. They see each other every day, but they still hold hands. So this was quite at a very personal level, quite a contrast to this cold rendition of sexuality that I was supposed to be learning about in the classroom. So that's when I started, in a way, my parents were the first pushing back. It's like, this doesn't jive with what I know. And I think also about the ways in which I talk about my aunts a lot in this book, the ways in which they creatively circumvented disciplinary measures to pursue and to pursue pleasure. So I think it starts there, and it just continued. And I think over this time, I just kept bringing it all together. When Duke was trying to decide where to put this book, they couldn't quite decide because, like, oh, you're talking about legal cases, but you're also talking about art, but it's about the Caribbean. So, I think in the end, they put it in 3 different catalogs because it wasn't clearly fitting any one space. And that's because my only real driving question was, what's the truth of this? What is the difficult truth of this space? Um, and I think starting from that kind of confrontation as an undergraduate student and moving through the many years later, moving through, discovering that I was attracted to men, moving through falling in love, like through all of those fears, they all registered in the book. And this was a chance to just narrate them together.
I think it's telling that the categorization for this book is so difficult. I think that's part of what makes it so necessary. And you've answered the question beautifully in searching to begin a story like this, which is not just one story, but so many that are contingent on each other. And in speaking of sexuality, gesture profoundly to history and sociology, economics, politics, every way that a Caribbean person can be in and out of themselves. One might think a book like Nature's Wild would rely heavily on secondary texts and sources about gender and sexuality. And while that's true, the references are plentiful and abundant. And it's beautiful that to begin all of this, you begin with yourself, making yourself the fully vulnerable and intimate subject that the reader gets to meet. From your childhood and your boyhood and your explorations of love and desire, the references are incredible and they span the entirety of your life to date. And it made me intensely curious about what it was like to make yourself the unflinching subject of so many examinations in this book. Did it feel like an inherent point of contention, or did you open yourself up to this process as you got more and more into it?
It's funny. One of the things one of the thoughts I had leading up to our conversation today was, wow, what if I got to write this book without the constraints of academia? It is very much a social science project written in the ways that one, is refereed by different experts in the field. It has to contend with, a specific set of literatures. And I thought, all of those things, all those sort of institutional demands, I was like, I would have been so much more vulnerable and so much and offered perhaps a deeper engagement. Um, than the book. So I love hearing you say that you recognize the vulnerability. For me, I think I could have gone further
Hmm.
if I could shed some of the constraints of, my existence as like academic. I had to always be, bringing the evidence. I had to always be making the case in court, in the ways that a court understands a case could be made. But I do like the idea, and this is the beautiful intimacy of literature, right? It really allows us to go deep inside the human condition. And for me, that's also where art is, and that's why there's a strong relationship between a stronger and stronger relationship between my academic practice and artistic one, where it's in art, I feel I get to really then push my vulnerability. And I'm certainly not there yet because I'm so used to translating for the institutional demands of scholarship that I am, I am still practicing how to achieve and be comfortable in that kind of vulnerable space. So I think the things I offer in Nature Wild were not truly difficult to share, but I think I could go further. And I think that's what you'll see in the kinds of artistic projects that follow from it.
I think the question that has just arisen from Alette Liz Williams in the chat, thanks for sending this in, Alette, is perfectly tied into what we're talking about right now. So I wondered if you wouldn't mind addressing it. Alette is asking, was there any challenge in making such a bold decision to write on what almost seems like exposés? Any fears or internal struggles?
In terms of an expose of myself, no. First, because I'm pretty boring. There's a whole lot of dirt to dig up. And I'm also pretty, confident with who I am in this place. I can see, the things that are okay and the things that that aren't terrific. So in terms of myself, in terms of revelations about some of the characters in the book, um, I knew, I think, where the line was between uh, sharing a truth of a moment and infringing upon someone's privacy.
Mhm.
So of course, I named the school. I named Presentation College. I think it's really important to have these conversations because I don't think, you know, Presentation College used to have hundreds, like many of these Catholic schools had hundreds of colleges, and only a few of them remain under the conservatorship of the Catholic Church. And I don't think Trinidad has gone through enough of a conversation about sexual abuse and its ramifications in this context. So I had no hesitation in sort of in reporting what I knew to be the facts of my experience, which in fact were relatively light. One of the things I wish I could have done is interviewed more alumni, but the book covers so many territories that I couldn't really veer away. So I didn't really have internal struggles about exposing myself, partly too because I'm very terrible at not at pretending to be someone else. So I deliver who I am pretty quickly, so that comes across. But I think I wanted to share truths of uh, different moments without infringing upon the privacy of people that were not named but described in the book. That was a conscious decision, but less so in thinking about myself.
That's a beautiful answer and practice. And as we speak of other voices and other presences in nature's wild besides yourself, there's no way to evade the fact that this book is remarkably polyphonic and polyvocal. The wide-ranging generosity of all of its frames of reference. And I'm thinking particularly of the visual artists you've called upon to help amplify and deepen and qualify the central thesis of the book, which is paring into that vast maw of what makes us feral and wild, and whether or not we can accept that fully. Your gestures towards those artists are amazing and moving. And I wondered if you could talk about some of your relationships with them. The artists that I'm thinking of in particular, you can see them on the cover of Andil's book. In particular, Kelly Sinapa Mary, though of course Andil features many other artists. So, Andil, if you could tell us about these generative links you've formed with these visual artists and what they've done for your practice and your work.
Well, certainly the most important artist is Lorraine O'Grady. In many ways, I think of the book as in its entirety as a riff on my first sort of formal conversation with Lorraine when we met in 2010. Um, Lorraine O'Grady, for those of you who know, is a very important feminist African American artist. She recently had at the age of 86, had her first major retrospective show at the Brooklyn Museum in New York City. Shockingly brilliant. This hair of mine is the most intimidated I've been in front of someone. She's incredibly brilliant. And it was really this first conversation in which we talked to each other about our work and interests that really, I think, advanced my intellectual curiosity and ability to think through some of these questions about our wildness. There's a quote from Lorraine, which actually I'll read at the end, but the gist of it is that sex is the place in which we can't hide our animality. We are stripped bare. We are down to our desires. And as much as we might work in the rest of our lives to take on culture as a way in which to show that we are not animals, it's in the place of sex that we cannot avoid our animality. And that means all of it. It means the animality of that is beautiful and comforting, as well as the animality that is violent. And so Lorraine's work, I mean, these conversations stemmed from two projects. First, a diptych that Lorraine had done in which she examined interracial sex between Black women and white men. And then a project that we worked on, her video, Landscape Western Hemisphere, in which our conversation was a prelude to the production of that work. So the animal question, Lorraine was just the most important figure in this book, and she remains important. We've just completed about 8 hours of interviews this year for another kind of dialogue piece. She's easily the most important intellectual influence. And then you have Kelly Sinapa-Marie. I'm actually wearing one of her prints that I've turned into this jacket. Kelly Sinapa-Marie is this incredibly talented, thoughtful artist from Guadeloupe. There's an entire chapter about her work in the book. It's the only chapter dedicated to a single artist. And I am blown away by her capacity to take on, to register, to interrogate, and to reflect upon the very complicated space we live in the Caribbean with such honesty. So her approach to registering her life in Guadeloupe, and also in researching the lives that preceded her, is really to embrace all of it, to not come up with, say, either this sort of statement of pride, which I think is not uncommon now. A lot of the ways in which we think about heritage and our culture often gets reduced to a kind of statement, either about suffering or about pride, and which I don't think is the full story. And what we find in Kelly's work is an ability to confront the difficult truth, the whole truth, the ways in which that that experience of colonization has been brutal, has had openings, has had change, uh, has produced change in all kinds of ways and continues to evolve. Um, and we see in her work the centrality of that contention with her animality, because through the whole colonial project, the work has been to situate the colonized person as more animal than human. And then colonization ends, and we're left with the formerly colonized subject now constantly proving their humanity by registering others as less human. So, we find in the book, there's my favorite chapter is probably the one on clothing, in which we see things like dress codes. I mean, those of you watching from Trinidad, Jamaica, other countries are familiar with all of these dress codes that are listed in public offices. And what's their function? Their function is to say, it's a civilizing project, that you have to wear the right clothes to show that you're a full person. It's a ridiculous notion, but it's the heritage of colonization. And Kelly in her work is able to challenge that kind of heritage as well. But I love that her work takes us to all of these different spaces, is deeply engaged with the natural environment. We've worked on projects together that produce hybrid animal human figures. Our next project looks at botany. She's just completed some truly beautiful paintings that will show in New York starting in June, in which she looks at her parents with new eyes, um, through this lens of, culture and nature.
What you say about Kelly is it echoes so perfectly what you say about Colin Robinson, from whose chapter we've been lucky enough to hear some passages, in that both Kelly and Colin and others have directly confronted the idea of animality as something repulsive or brutally othering, to arrive at a place that says, if I am an animal, so what?
Mm-hmm.
Which felt profoundly illuminating as a reader of the book, for the spaces of imagination and desire that that kind of acceptance and refutation of a base state opens up. And I'm curious about what kind of states you hope or see Nature's Wild opening up in conversation. Where do you think you are situated with the book as a journey? Does it feel like the end of a prodigious amount of research, or does it maybe feel like the beginning of a whole new series of conversations?
One of the It's been an important moment, and I think the place that I've been perhaps most vulnerable is to expose my own inability to claim my animality through the different periods of the book. I think there's something about me having been, a very good schoolboy, you know, the kind of boy that asked for extra algebra homework, that was a library prefect, like, it was just so naive in other ways, to just, did become the kind of, youth of the nation that Eric Williams called on us to be, at least in a kind of imagine, in like an imagined script, not a real person, but this aspiration to be, a good son of the nation. But there's a lot of cost to that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of cost to the lack of exploration, a lot of cost to not being wild, a lot of cost to not having those experiences that give you emotional girth. And I think this book that's the way in which I expose myself the most, is that I'm contending with this denial of my own animality and trying to claim it. And I think I am better at it for sure. But it's continuous work, because I had done such a good job, I think, in the context in which I grew up, of just, denying the animality. It's interesting, calling someone, it's such a deeply racialized trope, the animalization of Black and brown peoples. So it's interesting in conversations about the book, that is the part of the book that has been very visibly most uncomfortable for the interlocutors I've had, other academics from the Caribbean. Because what do you mean I'm an animal? That's the thing they kept telling us we were. And we are saying, no, we are not an animal. But I think how much more powerful to say, okay, we're an animal, we're animals, we're all animals. And what other, I know, particularly at this moment, we haven't, the ecological part of the book is more embedded than explicit. But
Mm-hmm.
for me, this is really a statement of allyship at this in this moment. It's a claim of identifying itself with, other disappearing species in this moment of, ecological crisis. So it is on one hand, for me, the claim of animality is a powerful anti-colonial gesture, and it is also simultaneously a claim of kinship with the natural world that does not that makes us aware of how deeply uh, tied our own survival is to that of others. And I think that is something I hope to continue to push further. I sort of see the end of the book as the starting point
Mm-hmm.
for the further development of that part in particular.
And on that note, I think nothing could be better than to invite you to share your second reading with us, Andil, if you would.
Sure. And this is from the very last chapter, which is also called Nature's Wild, but with the apostrophe after the S. The title of this chapter and book reference Nature's, a Guerrilla Girl story, a video that I conceived as an adaptation of The Clearing, Lorraine O'Grady's photographic diptych. Nature's subtitle references O'Grady's membership in the feminist activist group Guerrilla Girls, under which she used the pseudonym Alma Thomas. In my video, O'Grady's responses to my taped interview with her are laid over another diptych featuring interracial sexual desire, this time between two men. Nature's opening scene provides context for what is about to unfold. As the video on the left appears, O'Grady asks, "What is love?" After audibly signaling hesitation, she continues, "It all depends if you're talking about sex or love, right? For me, I think love is everything." We are now 25 seconds into the video, and the two male figures begin to kiss passionately right until the end of the 7-minute piece. You hear O'Grady again. "The problem with love is that it's every emotion, love and hate and distrust, giving over everything at the extreme. The sexual relationship," she says, "is always already imbricated in the social. The amazing thing is that when we're actually involved in the sexual act, we're not thinking socially, or we're not feeling socially. We're feeling totally individually, but then we're called to an account. Once the orgasm is finished, then we're called to an account." A moment later, she says, "I don't think most people want to think about the compromising, difficult parts of sexuality, even among, quote, normally married couples, But they certainly don't want to hear about difficulty in interracial relationships, or they certainly don't want to have the historical nature of this relationship exposed en plein air." And I think I'm just going to, because of the time, I'll skip ahead to just a closing piece of the book, because it all leads back to love. So I'd like to end the reading there. What opens up for us Caribbean people when we are freed from proving ourselves not animal? Many of the Caribbean people mentioned in this book have already shown us what is possible. For centuries, guardians of anti-sodomy laws have argued that these regulations were needed to protect against wild desires that threaten our humanness. But in no place has the decriminalization of sodomy produced this fantasy. Jason Jones's legal victory in Trinidad and Tobago has already prompted studies measuring the decision's impact, including one in which Jones is a collaborating investigator. Based on friends' accounts, media reports, and personal visits, I believe that what has changed since this criminalization is that some people feel safer and more people are educated about their sexuality and are often kinder about it. It is also possible that the Vindra Ramprasad ruling was playing catch-up with the social and cultural shifts already in motion. What is at risk then if the dress codes go too? along with all those various punitive rituals performed across the Caribbean in the name of civilizing the youth. Corporal punishment, high stakes exams that crush childhood development, over policing, and all other classist and racist injuries premised on assuming a humanness that is not animal. All that is at stake is the continued masochistic attachment to an epistemology that from its inception had no regard for well-being, our pleasures, or our worth.
Thank you for that, Ando. And as everyone who's joined us can attest, Nature's Wild is profoundly generous, wide in its reach, serious and playful in its implications, and absolutely necessary to the kind of world that we hope we can build better than the one we currently inhabit. I cannot recommend it strongly enough. And we will, of course, leave links directly to Andil's publisher, Duke University Press, so you can rush over there and get your copy. You can also contact Paper Based Bookshop if you're in Trinidad to pre order and reserve a copy if you're on the island. Of course, we can't let Andil escape without playing Promptly Written, which, for those of you who joined us last season, will remember is our game featuring an elevator and the pitch of a lifetime. The premise is this: Andil steps onto an elevator. On the other side of the doors are the publisher and editor of his dreams. They are talking about a subject that's very dear to them, and Andil, seizing the opportunity, gives them the pitch of a lifetime on that topic. And his pitch can be anything that has a creative output: a book, a sculpture, a film, a play, a drag show, absolutely anything his heart desires. Andil's Promptly Written is You Can't Make Love on a Hungry Belly. Andil, take it away.
So, immediately when what comes to mind is the famous Kaiso t-shirt that perhaps some of the people here know, that I believe Colin had a heavy hand in designing, but probably also collaboratively. And it says the homosexual agenda, and number one is bi cricks. I think I forget the order. It's in the book. Number two is spend time with family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, spend time with family. And number three is work for equality. And it is such a simple and beautiful way of talking about what's really at stake for us here and what we want. It's not something special, but it's to live and to survive. And so, I think, you can't make love on a hungry belly. Unfortunately, I can't see the prompt, in my terrible internet. But if I remember, that's what you said.
That's right.
So, I think, I'm thinking on the one hand, oh, what a beautiful correspondence with that T-shirt, and how I'd
Mm-hmm.
like to revive that T-shirt, and how I'd like to, continue Colin's work that he has also directed me to do. So I think how beautifully doing that kind of work and doing more creative work around it would be. And at the same time, I'm a person who lives in the gray. So at the same time that I think that that t-shirt talks about like the significance and importance of our social welfare, I'm also thinking about the project that I'm doing right now, which is the next exhibition that I'm curating here in New York. Its title is Everything Slackens in a Wreck. And what that exhibition explores is what are we what are we like in a moment of crisis? And, coming off the epidemic, living in this moment of fear of the nuclear war, living in the context of global ecological crisis, there's lots to be anxious and depressed about. And what I do is I look to the past in which there are other moments of crisis that people live through. And what is remarkable to me is that no matter what the conditions, in order to live, one must find moments of pleasure, whatever that is. One needs it to survive. One needs a joke. One needs affection. One needs physical touch. One needs to feel desire. And however terrible the situation, whatever the circumstances, rich or poor, that is simply something that the human condition, the human spirit is able to find. And so I am just, so that's what I'm thinking about in this pitch. And I probably would have gotten off the elevator and I'd still be thinking, they say, oh, there went my opportunity.
I think that's perfect, and I look forward to a revitalization of that famous Kaiso tea, which will always make me think of Colin Robinson, and
Yes.
now always of you as well. Andel, it's been such a pleasure. I feel like the time has flown, technical weirdness and all. It's been a delight to speak with you about Nature's Wild, a book that everyone, everywhere, should read to become more feral and joyful in that wildness. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your generous consideration of this text. Thank you for making space at Bocas, among all the beautiful works of literature that you normally feature. I really am touched, and I look forward to seeing you in person in a few months in Trinidad.
Yes, that will be beautiful and definitely a wild experience to be discussed off camera. Everyone, please join us again next week as Bios and Bookmarks continues at this time, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. Next Thursday, Akila White, our guest host, will be talking to Monica Minot, whose Zion Roses was longlisted for the OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature. So you won't want to miss that. Also, don't forget that our official festival dates for the 2022 NGC Bocas Lit Fest are 28th of April to the 1st of May. You can look out for the launch of our festival program in a couple weeks. And finally, if you like what we do, and I hope you do, please consider supporting us more closely at Friends of Bocas Lit Fest, about which you'll see more information directly after this. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andel. Please stay safe. Until next time.
Thank you, everyone. I hope to see you soon.